with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. Thank you so much. This is a very, very special episode for a couple of reasons. This is episode number 200. And so thanks to all of you for joining me on this journey and engaging in these conversations. And I can't tell you how excited I am for the conversation that we have lined up for today. Today, I have Alana Nichols, and she is a para-alpine skier, a sprint kayaker, and she's also a wheelchair basketball player. She has a fascinating story. She is a 6-time Paralympic medalist, 3 gold, 2 silver, 1 bronze. She competed in Rio, Sochi, London, Vancouver, and Beijing. In July 2019, she became a mom to her son, Gunnar Owen Alexander Tuscany. In 2000, at age 17, she landed back first on a rock while attempting a backflip on her snowboard. The injury caused her to be paralyzed from her waist down, but she quickly transitioned to adaptive sports. She became the first American female to win gold medals in both summer, wheelchair basketball, and winter, alpine ski racing, Olympic, Paralympic Games. She's a 3-time Best Female Athlete with a Disability ESPY nominee, and she works closely with her life partner's nonprofit, the High Fives Foundation, to support individuals with spinal cord injuries and traumatic brain injuries, returning back to life through adaptive outdoor sports. We have a commonality in Toyota. So it says here that you drive a Sienna.
Yes. Are you a Sienna driver?
We were. So we've moved on from the Sienna, but you know what? It was the best car. We have 3 children and we could open up both sides of the doors and all the kids jumped in. And it was the first car where we took a road trip with all 5 of us. And it was it's my favorite car that I've ever owned. And I never thought I'd say that, a minivan, but it was awesome.
If I had an up-to-date resume, I would put minivan enthusiast, hashtag Toyota Sienna or whatever. It is the best car. There is so much room for activities, and I am always promoting how much equipment I can fit in there. I've got my wheelchair behind me. I don't have to take apart. It's the sliding doors.
Yeah.
Everything's automatic. I put my son in. I can fit 2 surfboards, my mono ski with all my skis. I can fit my basketball chair. I mean, I've got so much adaptive equipment, and a truck's not going to do it. SUV's not going to do it. It's the minivan life for me. It's so good.
It's all-wheel drive. I mean, it's just like it ticks every box.
Oh, yeah. Miles per gallon all day. It's the best car out there.
So, Alana, what else can listeners learn about you really quickly before we jump into our conversation today? Is there anything else you want people to know?
Well, yeah, thank you for that warm introduction and the list of accolades. I did have such an incredible athletic career. One thing I guess that wasn't mentioned was that I do adaptive surfing. That's kind of my main squeeze right now. I'm so in love with it. I like to change sports because I love to learn how. I just love the process. It's like, that's what fires me up. But a lot of what we do through my husband's organization, the High Fives Foundation, is we get to take folks out surfing for their first time. And I just love that. So hopefully we can touch on that a little bit later. You mentioned I'm a mom and I've got a little 4-year-old, and it's the best part of my whole life. I mean, I've had so many pinch me moments in my life, including meeting presidents and riding in Michelle Obama's motorcade and red carpets and all of those things. But the most amazing thing that I've ever done is become a mom. It's so normal and so extraordinary at the same time.
Isn't it so much fun? I mean, it's my wife and I walk pretty much every day. And so it's, 5:15, Orion's out. You've had some early mornings in your days. Ryan's right there as we are walking, and the Big Dipper. And we often reflect on how lucky we are because we live with these three just cool roommates. You kind of went through the drunken roommate phase when they were young. You had to put them in and out of bed, and they repeated themselves and they were emotionally unstable. But, it's just so much fun to watch them grow up. And I think my favorite thing, I mentioned us traveling in the Sienna, but really I discovered that I think my favorite thing in life is exploring new places with them. So it's Joshua Tree. Maybe it's the Arch in St. Louis. Maybe it's Yellowstone National Park, or we've been up in your neck of the woods in Reno, and we got diverted from Yosemite a couple summers back because of fires. And so we ended up in Reno. We were trying to get our kids to all 50 states. We stayed at the Grand Sierra Resort, and we just, we explored. We explored a forest that was a national forest that was near you. And it's just, I love having those adventures. And so I'm so excited for you because at 4 years old, there's a lot of adventuring.
Oh, yeah. My most recent adventure with Gunner is we were in Times Square last weekend, or I guess it was last week, Thursday. This is actually a questionable parenting move on my part, but I took him to Times Square at 9:30 at night from Lower Manhattan. So, of course, it's like, I'm not from there. I'm not a New Yorker. So I think, oh, yeah, Times Square, it's just like Midtown. And it took 30 minutes to get there. So it's 10 o'clock, way past his bedtime. Luckily, he had napped. And of course, it's just Times Square. So he's got a chocolate ice cream going in his mouth. And I was like, wow, I'm making some really questionable parenting decisions. But it was such an adventure. And there were so many moments, when the light switch was like, wow, in that particular little corner of the universe that is Times Square. And I felt so lucky to share that time with him.
Yep.
That's cool.
He won't forget it. He won't forget it. Being with mom in Times Square. And, okay. So I think I do want to get to surfing because I want to get to that. And then I also want to get to the foundation as well. But this podcast is really all about leadership. And Bill George, he was the former CEO of Medtronic, and then he taught at Harvard for a while. And he had a quote that I just absolutely love, which is, the hardest person you will ever lead is yourself. And as an athlete at the level at which you have participated and to the degree that you have participated, winning gold medals, I mean, a lot about that. The hardest person you will ever lead is yourself. How do you think about that quote?
It's a great quote. It's, in my opinion, true to its core. I've always said throughout my career, and even as I've changed sports so many times, it doesn't matter to me as much what happens on the main stage. The more challenging times that I've ever had were when I was alone. There was nobody watching me, nobody keeping me accountable. And I knew it. And I had to say, what are you made of right now? And then I had to be with myself with whatever decision I made. Was I going to go in the gym? I had to live with who I was in that moment. And there were times when I proved to myself what I was made of and how hard I could work. And there were other times I fell short. And, the hardest person you'll ever lead is yourself. As a strong leader and somebody that had to lead myself a lot, there were moments where I had to hold myself in love and say, that's okay. That's enough for today. Let's call it. Let's go home. Let's do what's right for you in this moment and not have any judgment about it. And then we'll come back and tomorrow's another day. As a leader, I think there's those moments where you have to hold yourself accountable and you have your high standards. But there's also moments where grace is equally as powerful as that strong standard.
And I love that framing. I mean, I think there's a balance there. Obviously, we can go a little bit too hard. We can be too hard on ourselves. But having that, like you said, that grace, sometimes this is what I need right now. In this moment, it's a pause and it's a break and it's some space. How do you know when you're in that space? Because that takes a heck of a lot of self-awareness.
The unfortunate part about being an Olympic athlete is you're going to be at your peak in your early 20s. The self-awareness piece usually doesn't come until much later. So it's trial by fire, and it's getting in there and pushing yourself too hard and getting an injury and, kind of taking your licks and like learning the hard way. But yeah, I think about my 20-year-old self and really remembering when I did grant myself grace and accepted myself fully for what I was able to give in those moments. But, one thing that was important for me during my athletic career as we train in these quads, right, these 4-year periods, was kind of being able to see the big picture and knowing that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's about being your best at that 4-year mark and not trying to burn out. Burnout is, common for anyone, athlete or business person, whatever it is. It's like, how much can you take without going over the edge? It's basically finding that line.
Well, and as an individual where it's, 2008, 2010, 2012, 2014, those aren't just quads. Those are, I don't know what that would be called. That's every 2 years.
Every 2 years. Yeah.
So having that balance and having that grace and knowing when not to let yourself off the hook and to get yourself up and to get into the gym, but then also knowing when it is time to step back and giving ourselves that grace. How else do you think about the quote, the hardest person you'll ever lead is yourself? Anything else come to mind?
Oh, gosh. Well, as a leader, I think you have to have, I guess, just about every attribute a good parent would have. Parents are leaders. And with that is empathy and compassion. And that really kind of sums up what self-awareness is, and being able to embrace yourself for who you are, right? So I know now, looking back, what my strengths and weaknesses are. And I more so now than I did when I was in my athletic career in my 20s. And I didn't have a lot of empathy or compassion for myself at that time. And trying to lead myself, I was a harsh leader. I was a harsh leader as an Paralympic athlete, and especially as somebody that did both sports year round. So I was training for basketball and then going into the ski season and, leading myself in those moments. I was gritty tough. And I learned that from the person that raised me, and that was my grandma. And my grandma being from that particular generation where feelings weren't really a thing or welcome at all. But also, I kind of think that her Norwegian background had a lot to do with her gritty toughness, And so for me, it was like, show up, do the work, no excuses, And there were times when I did get so burnt out that I didn't know if I could keep going. Looking back, I would totally have given myself more grace as I was training and leading myself. And, one little nugget of wisdom that I kind of derived from my athletic career was how really important it is to enjoy the process. I broke my back in the year 2000 in a snowboarding accident. Fast forward 8 years in Beijing, 2008, playing Paralympic women's wheelchair basketball, undefeated team, went into the tournament undefeated, left with the gold medal. It was all very Cinderella story. You couldn't have planned it better. But with the leadership that we had in place for that team, there wasn't a whole lot of enjoying the process.
Okay.
It was timed water breaks. It was very regimented. It was very serious on game day. and maybe it's a little bit of my personality that didn't vibe with that because I like to loosen things up so I perform better. I like to tell a joke before I push out of a start gate of a ski race before I'm about to risk my life at 70 miles an hour. I was like, how's my hair? Let's relax a little.
Here goes.
So 2008, we won that gold medal, and I am not discounting the effectiveness of the leadership. We won that gold medal. The next quad that comes around is London for 2012. We had a different person, a whole different leadership team, coach, assistant coach, all that. And that coach was really more focused on camaraderie, connection, a sense of right now is all that matters, not that end result. And going through that process of training and competing with that group of women for London 2012 is the warmest memories in my heart. I don't have any of that anxiety I have when I think about Beijing. And we lost in London on a bad call from a referee in the semifinal match, went on to play the bronze medal match. We played the Dutch, lost that, got fourth. It's like the worst possible result. So painful. But if I were to choose those two experiences, I would choose the latter, the London experience with those girls and that feeling of connection and camaraderie that I didn't have going into Beijing, even though the result was so drastically different.
Well, as you're speaking, it almost makes me think of like a Bobby Knight versus a John Wooden. You've got someone who's a little bit more, a lot more intense, rigid, structured, and is screaming, throwing chairs, and some writes a really good coach. And then you have a more sustainable approach from a John Wooden who is concerned with, okay, here's how you put on your shoes, your socks, actually.
Right, the socks first.
Then we'll start from there. And it's more even keeled. It's more emotionally intelligent. It's more sustainable. And people walked away, as I understand it, loving him. And as you reflect on other coaches, because again, as a coach, you're in a position of authority. What were some other attributes of coaches along the way that helped you be at your best?
Yeah, what a great question. I think using that same example, my coach from 2012 made me feel like I could get up to the plate. And this is the wrong sport analogy, but just swing away. Like he believed in me. I knew that he knew that I was a great athlete. And he made me know that. And that's all due to his good leadership that made that connection with me and said, hey, I know what you're made of. I know your potential. I know your greatness. And I'm just ready to sit back and watch it all happen. That feeling of relaxation and anything's possible, optimistic, all of that energy set me up to be the best I could be. And there were moments in London that I had that I was on the free throw line looking at this jumbotron, of my own face, like one of the biggest moments of my career, and looking at the score, and we're down one. My free throw mattered more than any other free throw.
Yeah.
And I sunk it because I had that leadership behind me, that belief. It was like I was being held up by that, really.
Yeah.
And it's so drastically different if you're playing for someone or if you have a leader that you're afraid to mess up. There's a difference between if you're shooting to win or if you're shooting not to miss. That energy that's just slightly different.
Yeah. And I loved your phrasing there, being held up. You're being held up. I mean, I love that phrasing. I don't know how to expand on that anymore, but there's a support mechanism there that helps you focus on the task at hand versus other things.
Exactly. It's kind of the same as I think when people say it gave me the strength I needed in that moment. I wasn't directly focusing on the fact that my coach believed in me. I just knew.
Yeah.
I knew. And that gave me the strength and the confidence I needed. And not to mention the ridiculous amount of free throw shooting I did in practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I knew was also going to support me.
Well, and you said something earlier in our conversation that was just, I can't agree more, that parenting is just this ultimate leadership experience, because in many ways, You're influencing your children to be curious. You're influencing your children to be engaged. You're helping your children figure out what it is, why they're here, what they can tap into. My daughter loves jewelry making. She will spend 4 hours on a Friday night. I never would have imagined that as a thing, but she tapped in and she loves it. She loves sitting there and making jewelry for 4 hours and talking with friends on a Friday night. And it's a similar thing. We're kind of Gunner, you're holding and providing that foundation and then lifting up and propping forward.
No, that's exactly right. And I've learned a lot. I served on the board of the Women's Sports Foundation for 6 years. And just recently, I was telling you about the New York trip that was for the Women's Sports Foundation. At that organization, we are such believers in the positive byproducts of what sports do for kids in terms of learning confidence and goal setting and achieving and discipline and determination. And there's no way to truly know your own strength until you prove to yourself what you are made of, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of how we kicked off this conversation. But, as a leader for my son Gunner, I know how important it is to push him in some ways and grant grace in other ways and be that soft presence that really believes in him, and it's been interesting as a parent and a leader with a disability, how much more longer leash I've had to give him. He knows his limits, I think, to a greater extent, because I physically can't be a helicopter parent in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
He's climbing on a rock wall and I'm like, hey, bud, you got to make a good decision right now, because what are we doing here?
What's going on here, guy?
So, it's been funny to help him learn his limits in terms of I'm not necessarily going to be able to catch you if you fall in a lot of ways. And I think that's been empowering for him.
I'm going to go back to the coach question. Any other attributes of coaches that helped you be the best version of you? Or what were some of the behaviors, we could ask it that way as well, that led to you feeling held up? Behaviors in those coaches that caused you to feel that way? Because it's a magic. There's a magic there when you encounter someone who pushes hard. And in the leadership literature, actually, it's called the zone of proximal development. You've got someone who's challenging you, but there's also support. And it's a good amount of both. We're not challenging so hard that someone shuts down. And it's not so easy that we aren't developing at the rate we could. But it's kind of that right space of challenge and support. Were there other attributes or behaviors that stood out for you in coaches?
Yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is there's this concept, really, I guess it's a concept that an athlete can either be task-oriented or ego-oriented. And a task-oriented athlete is focusing on personal goals and comparing themselves only to their best recent accomplishment or whatever, depending on the sport, like how fast you ran that last 400 or whatever. An ego-oriented athlete is comparing themselves to the other athlete that's running that race. They're looking to their left and right and where do I, end up in this group? And I think from a leadership position, having a coach focus on tasks that are directly related to each athlete, if you're creating this environment of ego-oriented comparison and kind of sizing everybody up, it's really pitting everybody against each other. And so I think what came to mind when you were asking that was my coaches that saw me with specific strengths and weaknesses. And actually, when I say see me, see me, my strengths, my weaknesses, what I bring to the table, what I'm not necessarily going to be able to bring to the table. And then were able to push me to reach my task-oriented goals. That felt like an obtainable pressure. It felt like this pressure that I see you and I know what your potential is. And I'm asking you to push to this extent. If that makes sense. I know I'm being very vague here, but there were definitely environments I was in where I felt like I'm always going to be compared to this other athlete. And that didn't feel obtainable to me. Yeah. That's not me.
Well, and you also said something in there that really stood out for me that I think is very important. And you said, see me. There's that kind of I'm seeing you, I'm working with you, and helping you focus on becoming the best version of you. But again, to your point, if I'm in an environment where I'm kind of looking to my left and looking to my right and being pitted against, then you don't have that psychological safety to become your best. Crazy.
Psychological safety. That sums it all up. When I was talking about the differences between my coach, the psychological safety I had to be the best athlete that I could be allowed me to reach my fullest potential.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just trying not to mess up. You're trying not to miss. And 99% of the time, if you're shooting not to miss, you're going to miss it. It's like a magical energy. When you have that closed off, like, oh God, don't just, it won't go. It just won't go. Yeah. It's like some weird thing just says, nope, that didn't have the right energy.
Yeah. Well, you said something at the beginning of our discussion that I want to get back to. And I forget exactly how you phrased it, but it seems that you are an individual who is curious. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, you like the process of learning and learning new. So talk a little bit about surfing and what that's taught you as you've begun to explore that sport. We, as a family, were in Venice Beach and we had a lesson with a gentleman, and both of my daughters popped up and they were surfing like right out of the gates, but I couldn't do it. It's hard. It's very hard.
Oh, wow. Yes. And it takes, I mentioned some gritty toughness earlier. It's such a hard sport. There's like this barrier to entry, which is the ocean. You have to get past the ocean to the outside where you can finally relax, but you've got to take a bunch of waves in the face to get to the outside. So it's like, if you can do that, then you've got a chance. And a lot of people don't, they're just like, nope. But, for me, I feel like surfing came into my life in a very divine intervention type of a way, because in 2014, which was the Sochi Winter Paralympics, I had big hopes for cleaning up. I had this enormous goal of winning 5 medals. After 2010 in Vancouver, I was the most medaling athlete of those games. And I was a rookie at the time, so I felt like I had so much more potential. And I had been training both for basketball and skiing. And so I was in great shape. And in 2013, the season right before the Winter Paralympics, I dislocated my right shoulder backwards, actually. It was like a really bizarre injury. I ran into a rock up at Mount Hood, Oregon.
Okay.
So I had to have my shoulder redone completely and then build my whole arm back up from square one. I mean, I was in a sling for 6 weeks. If the podcast listeners were seeing me right now, like I have this little normal girl arm and I'm a wheelchair user. I got a lot going on. So, I mean, this arm was like square one, building it back up. I get back on snow in November. I am real hesitant, some post-traumatic stress stuff. And then I make it to Sochi in March of 2014. And, it wasn't how I wanted to get there. I wanted to be preseason training and working on really important fundamental skill stuff when I was still trying to get my arm back into shape. So it's a scramble. I get there. I make a huge mistake in the downhill, and I actually won a silver there. And I never thought I would win. I would ever feel like I won a silver, but after the mistake I made and then made up for all that time, it was like, wow, I won this. This is epic. So I'm gearing up for the next race, which is the Super G, feeling really good about it. And I made another mistake almost in the same spot, ended up falling on my face, hit chin first and just got knocked out, and helicopter ride to the Russian hospital and everything. And, it was just kind of heartbreaking how much I tried and how little it was working out. I was trying so hard, all that after the shoulder injury, and then I, fall on my face. Long story short, that led me to taking my grandma on a trip to Hawaii. Okay. And so one of my sponsors from the 2014 games had asked me if I could go anywhere where I would go. Of course, I asked my grandma, who is my actual saint and angel, and whatever you want, where do you want to go? And she said, I'd love to go to Hawaii. I want to see the Pearl Harbor Museum. So we went out there, and while visiting, came across a friend that was on island that told me about this program called Access Surf. And Access Surf is a nonprofit in Honolulu that will take anyone with a disability out in the ocean and teach them how to surf.
Yeah.
And they went totally out of their way, took me out on a day off. Like they just are just awesome. That's aloha, right?
Yeah.
And I caught my first wave at Queen's Break in Waikiki. And I was like, well, I'm ruined. Like, how am I going to go forward with my life now that I know how this feels? Because for anybody that's never surfed in Hawaii, it's like a therapy session for your heart and your soul and your mind. And you get out of the ocean and you're like, I think it's going to be all right, no matter what it is.
It sounds like a Jack Johnson song.
Totally. It's so cliche. All surfers are like, man, it's so spiritual. And it is. It just is, you know? And sitting out in the ocean and feeling so small, and also just, you know, there's scientific evidence to show that being around a body of water is good for your mind. And it is. So after that experience in Hawaii, I found myself living in San Diego, training for sprint kayak, but surfing also, and just fully immersed, I will say, as a play on words, in the water, but also in the sports of, you know, water sport. And it gave me that reprieve from all the pressure that I've felt from both of my sports. And, you know, I found this competitive side of me in adaptive surfing that, you know, I got to scratch that itch of competitiveness, but it didn't hurt so bad when I hit my face on the water. And that was like, yeah, let's do this.
Do this. Not as difficult as a mountain.
Yeah. And, you know, but also just to go back to the cliche spiritual stuff, I think what I'm constantly searching for is, you know, a lot of athletes call it being in the zone, but it's that feeling of when you don't have anything else to do but be in that moment.
Yeah.
And when you're on a wave, there's nothing else. So it just shuts everything down. And it's such a beautiful release of just like, none of your problems matter when you're out in the ocean. Like there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And there is a wave coming this way and you're excited about it. So it's just like this beautiful, like therapeutic thing that I'm so grateful came into my life.
Well, I think it was probably last year around now. Maybe you've watched this series on HBO, 100-Foot Wave. I think it's called Max now. Have you seen that series? Oh my God. It's an incredible sport. And I have so much respect. I really, really do. Well, as we begin to wind down our time, would you talk a little bit about the High Fives Foundation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for asking. Well, so I came across the High Fives Foundation just as it was being founded in 2009. The founder and CEO happens to also be my husband now, but at the time, he had just broken his back in a skiing accident as well. And so he went 130 feet on a 100-foot jump at Mammoth and came down and burst fractured his lower back at the same place as I did. So we both have a T12 injury, but he ended up walking. He recovered because spinal cords are so intricate and depending on how they're damaged. In terms of me and my husband, he would say that I didn't try hard enough in rehab. And I would say that he got like a paper cut spinal cord injury. But that's like, you know, between us. I'm like, okay. So anyways, he's this just great visionary. And when he got injured, he had all of this support coming from the parents of the kids that he was coaching at the time. He was coaching moguls. And so, you know, after all that support for him to go through rehab and try to recover, he had $500 left over from that support and decided he was going to start the High Fives Foundation. And so I met him in 2010 after the Vancouver Games, and I was on top of the world. I mean, I had just become the first female American to win gold in the Summer and Winter Games and the most medaling athlete of Vancouver, both Olympic or Paralympic. I mean, it was a good time for me.
Yeah.
And so Roy, when he met me, was like, who's this big deal? You know, it was like good timing. We actually worked together over the following 10 years, just as I worked as an ambassador and he was continuing to grow his foundation. And I just really loved what he was doing because it was so different from anything I had experienced with adaptive sports organizations prior. And the difference really was that he is a person with a disability that's running a foundation for people with disabilities and creating an environment that felt more like normal than it did us and them. So like, there are organizations that if you're somebody with a disability and you access their resources or their programs or whatever, it's kind of like able-bodied people and the disabled and, you know, they're helping you and everything. But like with the High Fives Foundation, it's kind of like this Ohana. He talks a lot about the Hawaiian word Ohana, meaning family. It's like, we are with you in this experience because we know how it feels to have a life-altering injury come out of nowhere and change everything. And we're here to support you from the beginning and till the end, you know, and that's really powerful. And it's also really amazing to feel like you're in a cohort of people that are your age and that know your disability. And so anyways, I always admired what he did. And then about 5.5 or 6 years ago, we reconnected at one of his fundraisers and we're both single. And next thing you know, we're like, why don't we do this thing? Why don't we do this together? You want to do this together? And I was like, okay.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'd love to have a conversation and learn more.
Absolutely.
I would love.
Yeah. I will for sure connect you too. He would love it too.
Well, my final question is always, and this could have something to do with what we've just discussed. It could have nothing to do with what we've just discussed. But is there anything that you've been reading or streaming or listening to? I know you love podcasts. What's something that's caught your attention in recent times that listeners might be interested in? And again, it might have nothing to do with leadership. It's just something that's like caught your attention. Anything come to mind?
Absolutely. Well, as I was preparing for this podcast, I was listening and it wasn't necessarily related to leadership, but I was like, this is so interesting to me. So Gabor Mate is a psychologist and an author, and his most recent book is called The Myth of Normal. He discusses a lot about childhood trauma and attachment and how those early childhood experiences affect the way that we attach and relate today in both romantic and business relationships. And what I'm most interested in and always have been is like, what makes people the way that they are? What makes them tick? What makes them react in certain ways? And I think Gabor has really figured it out. And his book, The Myth of Normal, it's like New York Times bestseller. It's all over the place right now. He talks about this culture of people pleasing as it specifically relates to women and how a lot of different autoimmune disorders and cancers and things like that will show up in people that don't and haven't found their no, haven't been able to say no, haven't been able to set a strong boundary. And that's just really interesting to me, both as it relates to me, but my family members, my sisters. And so I've just been really digging into that stuff, shadow work, childhood trauma. It helps me understand how I relate, but also how other people are relating to me.
Yeah. My undergraduate degree was family social science, so marriage and family therapy. And
that's great.
Kind of exploring, looking within, reflecting, making sense. I will put that in the show notes, and I'm going to go ahead and download that on Audible tonight.
So good. It's really good.
I will. That's awesome. Well, Alana, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your incredible work that you do, whether it's in the kayak, on the mountain, or in the ocean. Thank you for modeling the way and just being an inspiration to so many people. I have really, really appreciated your time today. And just thank you so much. And I do look forward to that conversation about the High Fives Foundation. I think that we can learn a lot from people who are doing the work and making a difference out in the world. You're one of them. So thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you for saying all that. No, it's my pleasure. I've been put in this position for a reason, and I'm stepping into my power as an inspiration. And I know there's other young girls that need to see me doing this stuff. So I appreciate you seeing me in that way. And thank you for having me on your podcast. It was really a fun conversation.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, be well and
Yep.
take care and have fun out there with Gunner.
Yes. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
What a perfect way to cap off 200 episodes. Alana, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, sharing your story, and sharing your experiences of competing at the highest levels. Just such a wonderful conversation. And I just have immense respect for anyone who has led themselves to some of those highest levels that a human can go. It's pretty incredible. It's absolutely incredible. But I think something that she said in there was just absolutely beautiful. I mean, there were a lot of things that were beautiful, but one thing that really just stood out for me is that do we also have that grace and that compassion for ourselves in those moments when we need to slow it down, when we need to take a break. And finding that balance is such a critical place for each one of us. I often think of this thing called leadership. You know, Sean Hanna said ethics is a team sport. And I think leadership is a team sport as well. And do you have a team of individuals, thinking partners surrounding you to help you make sense of when you're at that line? And she spoke of kind of that space when you're at that line that sometimes we always don't make the best sense of in the moment. Do we have that team around us to prop us up, to help us make sense so that we can, so that it's sustainable? And for many of you who are leading right now, listening to this podcast, you know that at times it can feel unsustainable. So how do we navigate and find that line and make it an endeavor that is more sustainable? Because what's required of certain individuals is just Herculean. So, Alana, thank you so much for serving as the 200th guest. I couldn't think of a better way to celebrate that milestone than that conversation. And for those of you who are listeners, first time, long time, thank you so much. For me, this has just been one of the highlights of my career, this project, speaking and learning from individuals all over the world and learning from them and learning alongside all of you. There's certainly a lot more to learn and a lot more to make sense of. And I can't thank you enough for being along this journey with me. So take care, everyone. Be well. Here's to another 200. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.